What's going on, bottom line viewers? It's Mitch here, back with another NFL video. In this video, a interactive video. I wanted to incorporate you guys into this video. This video is going to be me answering your questions, determining whether the player, the team, the coach, the thing that you asked is overrated or underrated. Many of you didn't actually follow the procedure correctly. You gave your opinion, which is totally cool, but I'm going to take pieces out of that opinion and determine if you are correct, if it's overrated, if it's underrated. This is overrated, underrated, or properly rated. If that sounds good, don't forget to spike the like button and subscribe to the channel for more BLV just like this. Many of these questions come from the Discord community, the Bottom Line View Discord, which the link can be found in the description if you'd like to join the community, where we talk plenty of ball in there. We also talked many other things, including soccer, the NBA, movies, music, and more. Join the great community of BLVers and get closer. We also always have announcements and things going on in there, and you can be involved in some of the topics and the videos that happen here on the channel. So definitely check out the Discord. The link will be in the pinned comment as well. Now, let's get started with your questions and your overrated, underrated comments. Let's roll. Now, the first one comes in from the man himself who organized this activity for the Discord. He is the general of the Discord. His name is Turtle, the big Saints fan himself, Turtle. Now, he doesn't have many Saints on this list, but he has plenty of questions for me. He says, first, here's mine. Jalen Waddle, Michael Gallup, Russell Wilson, Khalil Mack, Chase Young, Marcus Davenport. We have a lot of players to choose from here to go overrated or underrated. So, beginning with Jalen Waddle. Is Jalen Waddle overrated or underrated? Personally, I believe that Jalen Waddle is underrated right now. I think a lot of times, rookie and young receivers especially are underrated. People don't give them enough credit soon enough. Now, I understand that a lot of his stats were piled up through RPOs and quick screens and passes, but this guy is dynamic. I think he would succeed in any offense through his speed and his pure ability. This guy is underrated. Michael Gallup is a tough one, which I received multiple Michael Gallup questions, which is kind of odd. We really haven't seen a ton of Michael Gallup lately, especially last year. I think over the course of his career, he's generally been underrated as a perimeter receiver who's really good down the field, especially, and a pretty underrated route runner. But coming off the injury, I could also see him being overrated, as people have now familiarized themselves with the name of Michael Gallup, but don't quite actually realize how that injury might affect him. So that one's kind of up in the air. Next, we have Russell Wilson. I think the majority of people, the public, overrates Russell Wilson. I think Russell Wilson used to be one of the best, very best quarterbacks in the NFL. But I have recently come to have questions about Russell Wilson's game over the last couple of seasons. I've definitely lowered him in my tiers of quarterbacks and rankings. And I do think right now he's being a little bit overrated because he's on a new team and people are hyped about that, which is totally understandable. Next, we have Khalil Mack. Khalil Mack, I also think could possibly be overrated, but I also think he's kind of underrated. I think there's some people that overrate him, in the large scale of maybe all-time greats at this position, as Khalil Mack was always billed as like the next coming of like Lawrence Taylor-esque type player, or at least a DeMarcus Ware type. But he hasn't always lived up to that billing. He's had great moments in his career and big seasons, but I think he hasn't been as dominant, as consistent as maybe we would have thought he was kind of gifted and probably should have been, So I feel Khalil Mack was maybe a tad overrated at times, but now he could be underrated. He's in a big spot with the Chargers. I feel like complimenting Joey Bosa, it might give him a little bit of a spark, so to speak, on the Chargers to get back to his dominant self. Chase Young, injuries have also been big. Chase Young is definitely overrated in my opinion. I think a lot of people go off the name value of Chase Young, but through his first two seasons, he's largely been an ineffective pass rusher. His first season was pretty good, but I don't think it was as dominant as people think. I do think he's a great athlete, but he really very much reminds me of the next coming of Jadeveon Clowney. a little bit overrated over the course of his career, a great athlete who's just not a natural pass rusher. The next player is Marcus Davenport. I think is underrated. Marcus Davenport was phenomenal last year and has been phenomenal over the last 2 years when he's on the field. So Marcus Davenport is definitely underrated, and I could see him being the best pass rusher on the Saints as soon as this season. Next, we've got the Panthers defense, which that's tough. I don't think they're generally underrated or overrated, really. I think people realize they've got talent for the most part. Maybe the general public underrates the Panthers defense, but I feel like most NFL fans know they're kind of pretty good. But I do feel entering this season, they might be a little bit overrated because they did lose Hassan Reddick. I could see maybe that secondary being better, but then again, I'm not sure. So I think the Panthers defense might not be as good as they were a year ago. I wouldn't expect them to stay at that same level. So maybe a little bit overrated. I don't really know there. And then Brandon Staley is the final guy. I think Brandon Staley, for hardcore NFL fans, I think he's probably overrated. But I think for general public, he's underrated. I think Brandon Staley is going to be a great coach. I don't think he's quite there yet. I think he's a good coach right now, but I think this is the season for him to truly take off. So thank you, Turtle, for those questions. That was Turtle. Let's get to our second set of questions, potentially. We have Mr. Singh, who says, here are all my overrated questions. Zach Taylor is the most overrated coach. I would say Zach Taylor is not the most overrated coach. I think if anything, Zach Taylor is underrated. He asks, the Cowboys have the most overrated defense, maybe by the public. I don't think by most people the Cowboys defense is overrated. I think most people understand that regression is coming for the Cowboys defense. And then the final question from Singh is, Joe Burrow is the most overrated quarterback in the NFL, which is an interesting question. I think there is an argument to really discuss that Joe Burrow is overrated because I feel like a lot of people gave him a ton of credit for success, the winning that happened in Cincinnati, and a lot of it had to do with Joe Burrow, but I feel like at the same time, they almost went too far with it. Like it was over the top credit for the Bengals' success. You know, whenever you're compared to somebody like Tom Brady for winning 3 playoff games or whatever, you might be a little bit overrated. And I do think that his personality and his charisma does make him a tad overrated by some. But I think if you put him as the 5th to 7th best quarterback in the NFL, I think you're probably right. So I don't think he's really overrated in the long run. I just feel like for a brief stretch of time, like during that January to February, when leading up to the Super Bowl, I feel he was a little bit overhyped, more so than overrated. So that's how I would answer that question. The next question we have here is from Bethel, who says, Joe Burrow, overrated, underrated. I already answered that. So New York Jets, overrated, underrated. I think the New York Jets are probably underrated by most people. I do feel like they've got a ton of talent. My questions come down to Zach Wilson's development and Robert Saleh and his ability to coach, as well as the rest of the coaching staff. But their talent itself is underrated. SoFi Stadium, I have it by good authority that it is very, very nice and that it is gorgeous. It looks amazing on television, and that's what I truly care about as somebody that watches these games and really has to, watch every game. I think it looks amazing. So I've never been there, but I would say that it looks really nice, and I would say it's probably properly rated. Probably not either overrated or underrated. The next question comes from the Jim Thorpe stan himself, which is your man Lenny B. He says, is Jerry Rice underrated? It feels like people generally underrate just how dominant he really was when he played. Is Jerry Rice under or overrated? I don't think he's neither. I don't think he is underrated or overrated. I think he's properly rated. I think most people believe that Jerry Rice is the greatest receiver in NFL history. And I think that most people is about 70+%, right? I think maybe people have forgotten how dominant Jerry Rice is, but I don't necessarily know if that means he is underrated. I would say if you think he's the greatest football player of all time, you might be overrating him a little bit. But then again, I think any player that was the greatest at their position can pretty much be argued as one of the top best of the best players in NFL history. So I think Jerry Rice is properly rated by most out there. The next question comes from Aqua, the real Aqua, the Bengals fan himself. He says he's got 3: Joe Buck, Noah Fant, and Bill Belichick right now. So first is Joe Buck. Joe Buck, I personally think, is underrated. I think a lot of people hate on Joe Buck, and I'm not the biggest Joe Buck fan, don't get me wrong, but you've got to think about it. Joe Buck is incredibly versatile in how he can call baseball, call football, call a multitude of sports. He's very professional in his presentation. He is kind of vanilla, but that's by design. I think what Joe Buck does best is set up his color commentator to have success. I think he makes Troy Aikman look a lot better than Troy Aikman is at times, or whoever he's with in the booth. And I do think he's fairly solid calling the game. Is he my favorite? No, but I do think he gets way more hate than he should. The next guy is Noah Fant. Noah Fant is underrated. Noah Fant has had back-to-back 60-plus catch seasons on the Denver Broncos with Teddy Bridgewater and Drew Lock at quarterback. For that, he's underrated. He's also a dynamic athlete. He can really run. He can block. He can catch. He can do it all. So I think if he was in a better situation, he would be a great tight end. And the third and final man here is Bill Belichick, who he says is Bill Belichick underrated or overrated right now. I would say that Bill Belichick right now at this moment is probably overrated, but I also feel in a way he's properly rated. I feel like if you put him anywhere in the top 3 or 4, you're correct. I think that's where you should put him. I think if you firmly put him at number 1 without a shadow of a doubt, I think you are overrating him, because I do think there's a debate that he isn't the best coach right now, as I have said. I don't think he is the first or second best coach right now. I think people have surpassed him. I certainly don't think he's in his prime anymore, but he's still a phenomenal coach. I think he still gets in his own way as a GM at times, but you have to remember he took a rookie quarterback to the playoffs. Just on the surface, I understand Mac Jones was a good rookie quarterback, but not many can do that and say that. So I think he is properly rated for now, but he's kind of on the borderline of being a little bit overrated potentially. The next question comes from Jermari, who says, is Demario Davis the most underrated defensive player in the NFL? I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. That's a really tough question. I think the most underrated defensive player in the NFL is probably somebody that doesn't get enough recognition. I feel like Demario Davis is at least somebody that for a long stretch of time people have regarded as very good. He's really good. He's never been the best player at his position in my opinion, but he's been consistently in the top 5 or 6 over the past 4 or 5 years, which is enough to say that he's probably underrated. If I were to say, is Demario Davis underrated or overrated? He's probably underrated. Is he the most underrated player? That's probably not true, because he's been around long enough for people to understand that he's good. Typically the underrated player, the most underrated player, is somebody that is just new to the scene, or maybe 1 or 2 years into being very good, and that player has yet to get the recognition, right? So I feel like Davis has gotten some recognition, maybe not enough, but some. Next comes from Dried Ocean, who says Tremaine Edmonds, this is just an opinion, Tremaine Edmonds is overrated. 6'5" fast linebacker that sucks in pass coverage, over pursues his gaps, which leads to big runs, example the Pats game, and can't shed off linemen. He's an average linebacker at best. His traits make him overrated. I do think that Dried Ocean is right in terms of draft position. His traits, his abilities physically make him a little bit overrated. Do I think he's as bad as that he's saying? No. I think he's still a good linebacker that should be starting in the league and is, probably a pretty good complementary backer to Matt Milano. But I don't think he is like one of these top 10 linebackers that the NFL thinks he is, that we saw in that ESPN poll. I think that's a little bit misguided. I don't think he makes the impact on the game in pass coverage or really in the run game that he should to be at that level. I definitely think there is an argument here to say that he is overrated as a player, but I don't think that he is bad by any means. I don't think he's bad. I think he's a pretty okay linebacker, like maybe even pretty good, but not great, not top 10, not elite, I don't even think he was in my top 20. So that's, probably top 30, right? Not top 20 though. And to me, that would mean he is probably overrated. Next man we have here is JuiceMan999, who says, are the Bills really the top dog in the AFC? And are the Eagles really the best team in the NFC East? I think personally that the Bengals are the team in the AFC this year. So he gives an opinion on top of 2 questions. So this isn't really overrated or underrated. I guess it is for the Bills and the Eagles. So we'll just start with the Bills. Are the Bills overrated or underrated? I think they're properly rated as the favorite of the AFC, and this is why. They have probably, in my opinion, the best quarterback in the conference. I know that people will argue Mahomes, but I do think it is Allen. I think that their defense is one of the best in the conference as well, on top of having a lot of weapons, which they added to. I think their defensive line got better. I think their secondary got better. I think they have the experience in the playoffs of going through trauma and going through dramatic moments and knowing how to play in those moments and building off that for another season. I think that's big. So I think the Bills' time is now. Absolutely, like John Cena said, I feel like the Bills can win right now. So I think that they are properly rated. Now, in terms of the Bengals being the AFC favorite, I understand that they won the Super Bowl last year. I think there is a very possible situation and scenario where the Bengals disappoint their expectations this year after being the runner-up in the Super Bowl. That happens often. I do think that a lot of, their success came from big plays and the Jamar Chase to Joe Burrow combination. I understand their offensive line got better, and you could argue their secondary got better, and on paper they should be a better team, but it doesn't always line up that way. I do think they got a little bit lucky. So I think the Bengals are going to be good, but I don't think they're as good on paper as the Bills are entering this year. I also think the Bills sort of had a bad regular season last year and will be much better in the regular season this year. And then in terms of the Eagles, I do think they're the most talented team in the NFC East, and I do think they're the best team in the NFC East. They are one of the most, if not the most talented roster in the NFL. I mean, you look at the offensive line's absolutely ridiculous. Like, I was going through every position group today. They've got arguably a top 3 unit on the tackle, guard, and center position. It's insane. The defensive line is loaded. They've got arguably the best interior defensive line in the game. They've got a strong corner group. They've got better linebackers now, arguably better safeties. A receiving core that's much better, adding A.J. Brown. The only question for them is Jalen Hurts and maybe their coaching. Outside of that, I think they're pretty much stacked. So I think that what they've been able to do to build this roster has been extremely impressive. I do think that gives them the edge over the Cowboys, even if they have the better quarterback, in my opinion. Next up, we've got Ultra, who says, Deontay Johnson for the memes. Is he overrated or underrated? I think he is absolutely underrated by a majority of people and a majority of NFL fans. When it comes to Durkant, he is absolutely positively overrated. He is not better than Mike Evans. I'm sorry about that. And he is not a top 10 receiver, but he is inside that top 15 for me, and that's where I would say he is underrated, because I don't think a lot of people put Deontay Johnson there. I also think he's been a bit disrespected in terms of fantasy value this year because of the new quarterback situation. Very good route runner, explosive receiver, makes yards after catch, very good player. Not, my personal favorite or anything like that, but an excellent, excellent player that is underrated. Next, these come from YouTube now. We've got Lydia, who says Yannick Ngakoue is a tough one to pin down. I'd say he's underrated because he's been consistently good, but he's also been on like 5 teams in the last 4 years. Honestly, Lydia, this one is tough for me to answer because when I reacted to Yannick Ngakoue and I didn't have him on my edge top 25 or whatever, people kind of got mad at me. So I do think there's a general consensus that suggests that Yannick Ngakoue is maybe better than I think he is. So that would mean I feel he's overrated, because I do think the thing about Yannick Ngakoue is I think he fits our particular set of skills in our particular system. I think he fits a 4-3 edge, just pin your ears back, get to the quarterback type of ability. When you take him out of that Seattle scheme, Gus Bradley type defense, and you place him in a defense where his responsibilities ask him to be more of a well-rounded run defender, I don't think he is a good football player in that regard. So I do feel he is a bit overrated by some people, but I do feel he's underrated for what he can contribute as a pass rusher. So there's kind of a good mix there. So that's why it makes it a really difficult question to answer. Then we've got Elijah, who says Jameis Winston is underrated. I believe he has the potential to play like a top 10 quarterback. Not saying that he will, but he has potential. Elijah, I'll say this. I think you are overrating Jameis Winston. I think a majority of people properly rate Jameis Winston, I would feel. I do think he wasn't as good last year. I just didn't feel like he was conservative. He was checking the ball down. He was inaccurate on the short passing game. I do think Jameis is underrated in terms of his playmaking ability, in terms of his escape ability, in terms of his pocket presence. I think he is good in all three of those categories, and he does have a pretty strong arm. He can make plays, and he can be a good quarterback. Can he be top 10 at this point in his career? I highly doubt that. I just think that's time has passed, to be honest with you. Next, we've got the Flicker, who says the Minnesota Vikings are a team to not sleep on this year. Also, Kirk Cousins should be considered a borderline top 10 quarterback. So are the Vikings overrated or underrated? Are they slept on, and is Kirk Cousins underrated? I would say that the Vikings this year right now are underrated. I think not enough people look at them as a playoff team, and I do feel they are close to a lock for me as a wild card team right now, so I will say that. And then in terms of Kirk Cousins, I do think that a lot of people underrate him because they look at his primetime ability, they look at his playoff record, which recently, by the way, Kirk Cousins has not been a bad playoff quarterback when he's gotten there recently. Look at that Saints game, he outperformed Drew Brees. But I do feel like Kirk Cousins is pretty much properly rated by people who know what they're talking about. Like, I think if you put him around the 14th or 15th or 13th best quarterback in the NFL, you're pretty accurate. I think if you place him in the top 10, I think you're inaccurate. Now, does he have the potential to put up top 10 numbers? Absolutely. But does that mean he's a top 10 player at the position? I don't think that's true. He's very accurate. He's a good player, and he could have his best season of his career, honestly, this year. I will say that. Nicholas Gill says the Bears are still a step ahead of the Lions with a better defense, quarterback, and coaching. So are the Lions overrated and are the Bears underrated? That's how I'm going to take this question. I will say that the Lions are actually weirdly overrated right now by a lot of people. This doesn't just include the Detroit Lions fans, but I think a lot of people weirdly are hyping up the Lions, which I just don't understand. I get that they improved this offseason. I get that they were a feisty team that were in a lot of games last year, but their defense to me is still lacking, and their quarterback position is just not there. I've seen Lions fans rank Jared Goff in the top 15. He's nowhere close, in my opinion. He's not going to win you games. Jamison Williams is still a season away, really, from being his impactful self, so he's not going to be there, which means the receiving core isn't quite what we think it will be. And again, I just don't know how much Campbell is really a great coach. He's a exciting guy. He's a great personality. Is he a good coach? I'm not exactly sold. In terms of the Bears, I do think they're worse than the Lions. I think the Lions are better than the Bears. But I do think, how could I say this? I do think you're right in some areas, but you're also wrong. I feel like the Lions, I'd probably take their coaching over the Bears because I haven't really seen the Bears yet. And then in terms of the defense, I mean, maybe, I guess. I don't really know, to be honest with you. I just think the Bears roster is kind of very bad. So then we've got Sports Today, who is a Lions fan himself. He says, excluding Brady and Mahomes, which quarterback would you want with the ball in your hands in a 2-minute drill, no timeouts, 75 yards, and a touchdown needed? So no Brady, no Mahomes. Right now, 75 yards, 2-minute drill, and a touchdown. So the first guys that come to my mind are Josh Allen, Derek Carr, Matthew Stafford, and that's probably it. So to answer that question with one answer, I think based on recently, I think you've got to give it to Matthew Stafford. I think Stafford, like Carr, I think both of these guys have been very underrated in terms of pulling out miraculous victories for teams that don't deserve it. And I feel like Stafford went to a team that did deserve it and elevated them in a spot where he could. And that's where people started taking notice when I already noticed it years ago. So Matthew Stafford definitely is that answer right there. Next, Grossi, sorry. Says the entire Raiders team, especially Derek Carr, Tua as well, all underrated. The LA Chargers overrated. So he's saying that the entire Raiders team is underrated, and especially Derek Carr, Tua as well, which I don't agree with, and then the LA Chargers overrated. So I agree with the Raiders take. I think the Raiders are actually, I'll say this right now, I think the Raiders are a contender in the AFC. I think they're starting with this. Derek Carr is a top 10 quarterback. Josh Jacobs is a top 10 running back, guys. He's good. The offensive line is going to be better through coaching. Josh McDaniels calling plays for Renfro, Waller, and Devontae Adams is going to be tough to stop. And then you look at the defense. The defense, I think, is underrated right now. I think the secondary doesn't get enough credit for the talent that they offer. I know a lot of the names aren't big names, but I think there's names there. I like Mullen. I like especially Anthony Everett. I like Morig as well. I like Hobbs. Like, there's some guys that I really like on the Raiders in the secondary. Chandler Jones and Max Crosby are going to be feisty up front, and I think their linebackers even are a little bit underrated right now. I think Jayon Brown was a fantastic add. So the Raiders are an underrated threat in the AFC. I will say that. Tua, is he underrated, overrated? He might be a little underrated by some people who just trash on him all day, but he is mostly overrated by the media, fantasy folks, and Miami Dolphins fans. I would say that kind of negates his other side of the fandom, to say that, of the NFL, where people just trash on him. I think that kind of negates it, so he's somewhere in the middle. And then in terms of the Chargers, I don't think they're overrated. I think that they are properly rated by most people. I think there's even some people that underrate them, including probably you. I think they are a stacked team, and I think they're going to make an impact this season. Next, we've got Jacob, who says, how underrated is Allen Lazard as a potential wide receiver one? I would say that Allen Lazard right now is being overrated by some fantasy people and fantasy analysts, because I don't see him taking this miraculous jump like Jordy Nelson or Devontae Adams did, with Aaron Rodgers. I do think Allen Lazard is a little bit underrated just overall as a player. Like, I think he's always been a pretty solid receiver, especially in the inside, in the slot. And I do think he's going to be productive for the Packers this season. Do I think he's a receiver, like a number one receiver? I mean, maybe for the Packers this year, but not really overall. Like, I would not put him in the top 32 talents in the NFL. So I definitely think that he's not underrated. I think he's just what he is. Like, he's a veteran receiver who's had some moments but hasn't truly proven it. I don't think he's neither overrated or underrated. The next question is Bumpman, who says Dak underrated. I would say that Dak is probably properly rated. I mean, I feel like he's flirting with the top 10. I think there's some people that underrate him, some people that overrate him, and it really depends on where you stand on the Cowboys. Like, I kind of think he's a little bit overrated by some Cowboys fans who place him in inside the top 8 and give him a ton of credit for things that I don't really know what they're giving him credit for other than numbers. And then he's probably underrated by like some Cowboys haters. Like, I think he's somewhere in the middle. Like, I think most people have given the respect where it's been due to Dak Prescott. Like, I think putting him in the top 12, in my opinion, maybe I'm underrating him in your opinion, but like, that's kind of where I put him, and that's, I think, where most people put him. So Dak underrated or not, I don't know, maybe. Next, we've got Gallup. I pretty much answered this already. I feel like he's underrated for what he's already achieved, potentially overrated for his future production. Next, we've got Deebo Samuel from Last Second Sports. Deebo Samuel, and why is the answer underrated? I do think, like, overall, I do think Deebo is probably underrated. Like, honestly, I think a lot of people give a lot of the credit of Deebo, and I'm the biggest Kyle Shanahan stan there is, right? You guys know this. A lot of people give too much credit to Kyle Shanahan for Deebo, but like, I feel like if Deebo was in any team, he would be good. Maybe not as good as he is in San Francisco because of how they utilize him in San Francisco, how Kyle utilizes him. But I feel like he's a much better pure receiver, like route running, like ability to catch the football in contested situations. Like, I think he's a better player as a receiver than he's given credit for. I think he's an underrated receiver. I think if he was in an offense where he had more volume as a receiver, he would be just as dynamic, better, numbers and all that. Like, I think last year's season was utterly ridiculous. He's just a phenomenal football player. I do think overall, though, he is underrated. Like, honestly, I do think you say, is the answer underrated? It is underrated. It definitely is. Next, we've got Connor, who says J.C. Jackson. Overall, Connor, I think J.C. Jackson, and maybe I'm a little biased as a Patriots fan, J.C. Jackson is underrated. I think J.C. Jackson is firmly a top 3 corner in the NFL, and I don't think there should be any debate about that. I mean, the guy played more man coverage against number 1 receivers in the NFL than anybody over the last 2 years, and look at his interception numbers. I mean, off the charts. He changes games. He's a dynamic player with the ball in the air. He doesn't allow catches. He rarely gets beat. And especially where he gets beat is not really threatening to your defense. He doesn't get beat down the sidelines. He doesn't get beat deep. He gets beat underneath. Who cares, right? So J.C. Jackson, I think, is a phenomenal football player and hasn't been given the credit that he should have been given already. And I think that a lot of that comes from him being undrafted. The final question comes from Zach Wilson's mom's friend, who says, which AFC West team is the most overrated going into this season? By the way, awesome name. Crazy division, and it's unlikely they all make it. Which team is the most overrated? I think by most people, it's the Denver Broncos. I think it's the Denver Broncos because of the Russell Wilson addition and because of the potential that the roster has. I don't think they're necessarily a bad team, but I think they might be a season away from being a truly dynamic contender. Like, I think there's just a lot unknown about this team. Russell Wilson's fit, the receiver position, the defense as a whole without Vic Fangio, the Javonte Williams, Melvin Gordon share, the tight end position, the coaching staff. There's a lot unknown when there's a lot more known about the Chargers, the Raiders, and the Chiefs. So I feel like the Broncos is the correct answer here. Some people might go with the Chargers because they charger, but that's not a good reason. I think it's the Broncos because the Russell Wilson addition has caused some people to overreact to that addition. So those are my opinions on overrated, underrated. Appreciate all the questions. Thank you guys so much, and we will see you in the next video. Peace.